Grobi speaking.
Hello, sir. Thank you so much for your kind cooperation. That is my pleasure to talk to you. And please let me proceed without any further forwards to my questioner, to my questions, which
yes,
are concerning...
I would prefer to
yeah, okay. I'm doing a research which is connected with the history of Russian educational policy on the eve of late 80s and early 90s.
Yes.
Could you please elaborate a bit how and when you first happened to contact with Russian policymakers and educators?
Yes. In summer '89, I've got an invitation from a professor at Moscow State University, professor of the history of education.
Mm-hmm.
His name is Edward Zeprov,
mm-hmm.
who became the first minister of education in the Russian Federation afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
The meeting took place in Sochi, so I was invited to deliver a speech, and now we make long walks and we had talks just before he became minister. And he asked me to be available if once the opportunity will come to the forefront, to be able to help him on reform. And
mm-hmm.
he started to say, well, the most important reform will be the rule of law, and democratic change without a solid piece of legislation will be no solid ground for
mm-hmm.
certainty of reform for the next future. So he phoned me after he became minister, and we met each other immediately afterwards. And so I headed a panel of experts composed by Europeans, but I selected the guys, and of course I had huge talks with Edwards on this issue before we visited him. So composed by Europeans and by non-Europeans. Among the Europeans, Oscar Anwarer
mm-hmm.
was the professor from Bochum University, I guess, the German university, who was the author, the best expert
mm-hmm.
on Russian or Soviet legislation.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking fluently Russian, like all of most other members of my panel,
mm-hmm.
except me, and that is also kind of a strategic choice to convince or to invite them to have a good translation of all texts in English, and to have also permanent translator,
mm-hmm.
but also on the other side to have academic leadership among my colleagues to eventually to improve exact legal terms into good English. So
mm-hmm.
it's a win-win situation. So the request of Edward Jerprov was help us with screening our drafts, co-draft new texts.
Mm-hmm.
What are the good examples, good practices, Europe-wide or internationally recognized good examples, and do it from European but also from international perspective. And that was the start of this committee with two Americans, one from Boston University, the previous dean of the Department of Education and Management, Charles Glenn, who is the best comparatist on earth on education policy,
mm-hmm.
and Jack Koons from Berkeley University, and then four colleagues from Europe, among them Oscar Anwarer. But also Leiden has a quite interesting or leading research institute and a journal on law, on legal issues dealing with East and Middle Europe. So we had quite interesting, quite ambitious, let's say, and quite selectively composed experts committee. And we met. What is the procedure? We met so at a regular basis every 6 weeks or 2 months. We had a meeting mostly in Moscow with first with the drafters of the text, namely with the legal advisors of the minister or the ministers of education and later of committee of higher education, with experts from their side, so the vice minister, the minister always attended the meeting, the vice ministers, Viktor Bolotov and well, as you know, long-standing tradition of vice ministers in charge of specific competence within the ministry. And then the legal advisor of the minister, but also academia, also representatives or highly qualified representatives from academies or from university. So we started with the basic law on education, and through this, well, 6 or 8 months, quite intensive. I remember very well this quite intensive collaboration between these experts or the committee of administrators, civil servants, the bureaucrats from their side, and a committee, the expert group from my side. After a couple of months, 6, 7 months, we reached consensus. We drafted the draft law on basic education, on basic law on education. And then, as we always do, we organized a conference, a symposium, also to invite academia, but also the public opinion and stakeholders. And with the strong support of the minister, we had also this public vote. So we published afterwards, and I would be delighted to send you, Peter, this copy of my text, because after all, we published 5 books on drafting legislation for the Russian Federation. And we did it because just our idea was to draft legislation, not just for the Russian Federation, although it is very strong, powerful, and also one nation, but also for the CIS countries. And we started with the basic law. Afterwards, we drafted comments on the on higher education. We drafted the law on special education. And second characteristic is not that we worked, as I mentioned, with the bureaucrats, with the civil servants, and the minister. But after Jeprov, Tkachenko, with Kinelov, with Filipov, so quite long time, 8 years, 9 years, on the law on special education, but also on other laws on quality in education, on qualification, on legal status of teachers. And after some period of time, we proposed the minister to start with a platform copied from my European Education Law and Policy Association concept. So I started now 25 years ago with national, but also with the European Education Law and Policy Association. And what is the purpose of that association? Is to create a platform of academics of several disciplines and faculties, not just from the law faculty or the faculty of education sciences, pedagogy or psychology, but also of social sciences, of economy, of history, and other relevant disciplines. But platform not just having academics on board and representative of academia in the largest sense, but also practitioners from the ministry, of course, with the minister, vice ministers on the top, but also legal advisors of cities, of oblasts, of republics throughout the nation, but also let's say judges, magistrates. So we had twice a meeting at the court on their jurisprudence dealing with education, and on religion, and on language, and on other issues relevant for education. So through education, as you know perfectly, through education you will cover the whole society,
yes,
and on all relevant aspects in society. Well, they have an impact, of course, on schools and on higher education institutions and on research and on one of the partners in education, namely parents, pupils, and learners, and students, but also staff. and also researchers. So the whole society, you can screen it through school and through higher education. So this platform, we wanted to replicate it also in the Russian Federation, and for that reason we started with the Russian League of educational policy, giving them opportunity also to start with courses and with training seminars for education lawyers and those academics dealing with policy in education, so the broad sense. Another characteristic, if I may, is we focused on the law, but always also on policy. And for that reason, it was so relevant to have also the best relationships with the parliamentary committee of the Duma. We had often meetings at the committee in the Duma. We invited members of parliament to come to Flanders, to Belgium. Mr. Smolin was quite often, well, several times, but also his colleagues in Flanders, in Belgium. He visited, on my request, also the Belgian Flemish committee within the parliament on education and on research, and he delivered several times a speech on Russian and Flemish and Russian Belgian and Russian European cooperation. So it is widening and widening and widening. On a certain moment, we got a request from the oblasts and from the republics starting a commission for research on let's say on comparative education law from oblasts and republics. So, as you don't know, Russia is a federal state. So, to some extent, also the oblasts and republics, the autonomous entities, can or have to manage on their way, on their manner also education legislation. So we had meetings in Perm and in Novosibirsk at the invitation of their ministers and their universities to have this comparative approach. And we published, so as we try to do always, published a book on shaping new legislation for Russia in education, using the regional aspect, regional component as quite strong and credible and a relevant factor for reform throughout the nation. We just not limited to law and policy, but the European Commission and the Belgian government and the Flemish Parliament invited me also to take the lead in other aspects of cooperation with Russia. And on the other vital aspects, Edward Jeffrov mentioned in the early 1991, namely how to make sure that there will be no monopoly anymore of publishing houses dealing with textbooks. He said, well, law is important, but textbook is another very delicate issue, and we should try to open choice, open freedom, open pluralism vis-à-vis teachers and principals and relevant authorities to make choices on textbooks. So we started a quite interesting project with editing and publishing houses of the Netherlands and of Belgium, how to start a publishing house in textbooks with the most, let's say, prominent publishing houses in the Netherlands and in Belgium in the education field. The third issue was on special education. So I mentioned already the draft law, and again there I will send you, if you have interest, my book on special education. Well, we should use it to inclusive education, but in that time, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, it was not that common to use these terms, so special education. And thanks to the let's say, the ambition, but also the leadership of Russian ministers and Russian members of parliament, we dedicated much of our efforts to special education, to handicapped, other able pupils on their special education needs. I have to say right now that are the correct terms. Special education needs through inclusive education, and we made an analysis of these special education needs throughout Russia, and I have to pay honor to the leadership of the Russians that they choose that topic as one of their priorities. Hello? Still online?
Yeah, that's fine. Okay. That's fine. That's completely fine.
For ethical reasons, it's so important. It was the first law dealing with special education in modern times. So I was so touched by their interest for the most vulnerable pupils in education sector, that they wanted to pay much attention to their future and their educational rights. That we paid, yes, quite much attention to that draft law. But also, I started, and again, I can deliver you some documents. I started with 4 or 5 projects in education for between brackets handicapped, for disabled or other disabled kids, pupils, on 4 or 5 issues. Autism. There was a huge consultancy on autism. Secondly, on remedial counseling. So we started with a quite interesting concept of how to you have to organize through schools at the earliest possible moment. You have to organize the diagnostic of psychological, physical, whatever diseases of kids at the earliest age. And in all evidence, the school is most appropriate medium for within a professional way, through counseling, through centers. And again, that was another specific sub-project within the global cooperation framework on special education. And also on training teachers for inclusive education. That was the third. So we had 3 or 4 specific sub-programs within that chapter of the project. Another issue was quite interesting, namely on the constitution and education. Again, through seminars, through a conference, we focused on how to cope with constitutional rights in education, and is that article of the Constitution, is that the most appropriate? Are there no contradictions within the Russian Constitution? And is it competing with high standards? What about the jurisprudence? And so on. And again, we published a book on the Constitution in education in the Russian Federation, with a huge conference with international leadership, extremely interesting. And again, I can send you the copy of the book.
Yes, I'd appreciate it very much.
From your side. So we had, through our talks, just to finalize, we worked in a very intensive way with the minister, at the top of the ministry, and the civil servants, the experts from the ministry, but also with members of parliament. And I was mentioned by the Duma for our efforts in several fields of education law. So and again, we even drafted a protocol of agreement between the committee of the Duma and the ELA, my European Educational and Policy Association, so that we promised to deliver comments on their draft law, or the pre-draft law, the first version of a draft law, to meet requirements from the international European perspective. We highly appreciate his openness. Of the Member of Parliament vis-à-vis the EU, but broader than EU Council of Europe, but also the European tradition. And thirdly, also with civil society, but also with rector conferences. Several times I was invited by the rector conference to give my comments on the draft on higher ed, not just as a committee, but also as a person. And one anecdote. Well, I pleaded for more diversity and more differentiation within the higher education, and to make universities more autonomous and give them ownership and quality control issues. And once I say, well, it's up to the leadership of the university to refine the mission. What are you standing for as a university? And to write down a mission and charter. You have to follow a whole procedure. I drafted a code of good governance for European universities for recent times, but that was already, let's say, that idea of how to deal with good governance. But the first issue that universities should articulate is what are we standing for? What are our aims? What are our purposes? What is our mission? And many rectors asked me during the conference, well, Professor Grove, couldn't you not give us a model, a format of that kind of vision? No, it's up to you to refine what are you standing for, not to prescribe what should be your specificity. So I had so good experience, so good feelings with this openness, internationally oriented higher education, but also with the education sector as such, and with this personal friendship. I can rely on personal friends, many, and I guess they also appreciated our love for, and our commitment to research. Just one anecdote. I advised the Flemish and the Dutch minister as the head of the cabinet. I was quite a long time head of the cabinet of the minister before becoming the government commissioner. That's my other hat. So I'm the hat of academic, as a professor. My second hat is of the government commissioner for universities. And my third hat is of, let's say, the international agenda, the chair of the European Educational Association, but also UNESCO chargé de mission, visiting Foy and visiting probably several universities on several continents. So that's my third. But as an advisor of ministers, we organized, the Belgians organized for the very first time, a ministerial conference of all ministers of the EU, an official council of ministers, minister conference of ministers of education of all 28. That time it was less, but it was less. Outside Europe, outside the European Union, namely in St. Petersburg, for the very first time, an official meeting of ministers of the EU gathered outside the EU, namely in the Russian Federation. It was in St. Petersburg. And I remember very well the commissioner for education of the European Commission at the time asked me, Professor Rob, why are you so interested in Russia? Why do we have to come here, not in Brussels or in a European capital? We have no nice capital. And we said, well, Commissioner, can't you detect the opportunity to be here, to have a talk with the Russian Federation on the common understanding of the future through education, culture, and research? It's crucial also for Europe. So, well, the fact that all ministers were there was a very strong sign that, yes, Russian Federation, and chiefly, well, from my perspective, education and research counts for our common agenda for the next. And that was quite repeated, this idea of common commitment quite often after the 90s, after the 90s, even in the year 2000. Sorry, you could interrupt me. I talked too long time. So sorry.
No problem. Jan, thank you so much for your answer to that question. And my next one, if we may take a step back to the process of compiling this basic education law of 1992. I mean, my question is how exactly this procedure of compiling the text of this law was organized. I mean, all drafts were first written in Russian and then translated into English, or you or Professor Anweiler have written some parts of the document and then they were translated for Russian colleagues. How this all was done?
Well, there was no one uniform approach. So on the basic law, the first draft in Russian, we asked for a translation by the ministry. Because it's from diplomatic side, international practice side, it would not be so delicate to make on your own a translation. That will be a big mistake. Because ownership, the question of ownership, but also not just of ownership, also of legitimacy. So the text should come from the authors. Translation, I mean, should come from the authors because they are responsible for the English version. Not just because we did not have the means or we had lack of interest. No, at the opposite. But that was standard. Standard was the Russians had to deliver us their own translations. But in specific fields, we delivered the first draft, namely on special education. We drafted an English version, who was debated at large in our mixed meetings, committee, and after translated in English, in Russian. We had always the same translator, Ludmila, the same person who translated also during the meetings, during the lunches, during the dinners, the ceremonies, during the visits of the Russian delegations to Europe, to Belgium, to Antwerp, to the Netherlands, always the same person. So, first, for technical reasons, she became a real expert in education law, but also for reasons of confidentiality and of effectiveness and of sensitivity. So it's good to work always with the same winning team. So it is standard was that the Russian version of the draft concept paper was translated in English. But we delivered also some texts to debate in committee and later on translated in Russian. And we delivered also several documents in English, sometimes in French and sometimes in German, but chiefly in English, just as an inspiring document for their bylaw or for the ministerial directives. And at the court, we gave, of course, jurisprudence in English and in other languages. At the Constitutional Court, by the way, there were several Constitutional Court judges speaking fluently French and German. Fluently. I'm talking on the 90s. So often we talked in even in non-English. Non-Russian. So there was the multifunctional approach, if I may say so. But again, I can give you a pile of documents in Russian. Well, I can give you. You should come to Belgium. Welcome to see my archive. They are quite impressive. All my Russian archives on draft legislation. Pile of pre-draft documents and notes during these meetings. But definitely, I will send you the books, publications. The last publication is on adequate legislation for education. I published with Filipov. Filipov You know him?
You mean the Russian Ministry of Education, Vladimir Filipov?
Yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Who was previously director of University of People's Friendship.
Yeah.
And who returned to his university after. So he came quite often to Brussels because he spent 1 year in French-speaking university in Belgium, so he's quite close to the Belgians. And I met him several times in international conferences. Always we spoke in French. quite good guy, and very very highly let's say appreciated internationally. So the modus was draft texts in several languages, but standard in Russian, translation in English by Russian competent authorities. Time to time we delivered an English version and had to translate it after debate into Russian, and the delivering of texts mostly in English and eventually not in
Of course, you know, I guess much better than me, that there is great diversity of national educational policies and systems across Europe. So, do you think that probably some national educational policies, for example, that the fact that in Belgium schools enjoy much greater autonomy than in many other European countries, had a special influence on Russian educational law? I mean, do you think that there were some stronger influences between, say, Belgian and or Dutch contexts, legislative contexts on the Russian law?
Yes, the answer is yes, but definitely, for some aspects of chapters of the basic law, counts also for other pieces of legislation, special ed, higher education, but also status of teachers, quality control. Definitely, there is an inspiration from Belgium, but because we are so European, you could say that, of course, there is diversity through Europe, throughout Europe, the 48 countries. Also, although Bologna not higher than. But good practices definitely were offered and had an impact, but not always with success. For instance, on economic chapter, on finance chapter, on vouchers, for instance, we made strong recommendations to be careful and not to go too quickly, and to deliver evidence that voucher system is not that evident. And I organized a meeting, ELA meeting in Roach at the College of Europe where I'm teaching. On exactly competitivity and on finance, in education also, strong chapter of vouchers. We are quite skeptical vis-à-vis the American interpretation of vouchers, and there are not that many excellent examples Europe-wide, excluded in vocational education, professional education, and yes, in Latin America there are some good Chile, some good examples, but there are not that is not standard. So the fact that we are living now with the third generation of education legislation in Russia, we were close to the first generation, and we had some impact on the second generation. But so the too rapid influence or the too rapid implementation of theoretically speaking good models was not in line with our recommendation to make a step-by-step approach, to make sure that leadership is there, and that let's say the positive environment is created. I will give you an example. I visited, at the request of the minister Tkachenko, I visited schools outside Moscow, and dealing with this variety of textbooks. Remember, textbooks. And I went to primary schools and I asked for textbooks. And still, in the 90s, there were still textbooks limited to the choice before 90. with showing quotations of the Red Army, showing Lenin and Stalin on every page of the textbook for youngsters. Well, even in the Davidoff school, although they should be quite committed to renewal, but some practices are very, let's say, implemented, or changes in practice are implemented very slowly. You need to create teacher training and training for principles and democratic character of a society. So, as I used in one of my speeches in Moscow on the OECD conference, well, I can write a law, I can draft a law in 7 months. I need 7 years implementing the law, and I need 70 years changing a legal culture of a country. So 7 months drafting a text, drafting a law, 7 years having implemented the law in according to a professional academic standard and legal standard, and 70 years having this change of mentality and of culture in society. It needs time. You can do it not overnight. It's not a revolution, it's a revolution. So, but of course, if the commitment is there, you can do miracles on a short time. But you need public opinion. You need commitments of teachers, the teacher unions and organizations. And for that reason, ownership is so crucial. It should not be one author or a couple of experts who will draft something. It should, yes, of course, they will deliver some input, but then huge debate should take place, and then the implementation phase, and a plan, and a progress report, and so and international reflections afterwards. So it's a long-standing process, and so we not always our recommendations were taken into account. But it was so exciting experience. I'm coming back to Moscow just only.
Again, as we're talking about the process of drafting this education law of 1992, you've mentioned already the initiative and the willingness of Russian representatives of executive powers. But as for legislative powers, deputies of Supreme Council at that time in 1992, did they participate in your work? Did they attend your seminars and meetings?
Definitely yes. In Moscow and in Europe, in Belgium. So, for instance, I remember very well, I invited the members of the parliamentary committee at home, my house in Antwerp, and I just can see before me Smorin, who is blind, as you know, playing piano during 1 hour with the kids. It's an anecdote, I know, but still, they are emotionally, for them, education legislation and working together with Europeans and with Belgians, with Flemish, was for them also a very sign of trust on both sides. And definitely we had meetings with both chambers in Moscow. Often we visited the parliament often or within the term of 10 years. And we had the expertise from several groups and fractions of parliament having their comments. So there was, to some extent, the international European cooperation and from my side also Flemish cooperation was for them a kind of a binding factor in co-reflection among competitors in Russia. Competitors in political terms, because they did not belong to one political party. But they did oversee. They did, for them, fractions or contradictions between them became not so important. It was a common approach at the invitation of European experts and Europeans. So it was a kind of a binding element, kind of an open invitation. I do remember very well several dinners, receptions, and lunches, work lunches, at the residence of the Belgian ambassador with N members of parliament and minister and vice minister together in a discreet, not hidden, but well hidden to some extent, but in a diplomatic, let's say, setting, and they created trust, created openness, and common understanding. And I guess that this is also the reason why, to some extent, yes, consensus was never easy. It was easier to reach under international, not co-ownership, but at the international invitation, achieved that European invitation. And Europeans were most close than Americans, definitely. So yes, members of parliament from both sides were intensively involved in all aspects of the drafting process of the law. Yes.
Jan, to catch up with your remark on the role of international cooperation for Russian educational policy in the 90s, have you ever, while drafting education law of 1992 or later on, have you contacted more or less closely with the representatives of international financial organizations like World Bank or International Monetary Foundation or some others?
Yes, but on not chiefly on the drafting process as such, because well, we are also let's say experts from the technical side. So we are professors of law and working with experts from the ministry and from the Duma on their draft. So it's good to do it on a bilateral way, although that both sides were very multifunctional and diverse. Say that to some extent. But on cooperation with the OECD, with the World Bank, also sometimes with the EU, besides we were supported by the EU. And with what else? With Organization for Security and Peace in Europe, we invited them to join us for the conferences. We co-organized with the Russians. So it is our leadership and not World Bank's leadership or OECD leadership, of Council of Europe's leadership, but we invited them. So Council of Europe and World Bank and OECD sent their experts to our conferences. For instance, on finance, for instance, on federalism. I organized an excitingly interesting conference on federalism, on cooperative federalism, and on ways of how to govern that big nation with regional component and looking at diversity. For instance, on legal status of minorities. A quite interesting paper. I asked it for a research paper from Russian side, and there was a working group, academic, composed by academics and experts from academia, and universities, and academics, universities, and expert committees on legal status of minorities, or on minorities and such. Extremely interesting paper. So that was in English, and we debated it with our advisors, with our members of the committee, and then we put it, let's say, to more public forum in a conference or a seminar where we invited them a third step leaders from international community, but we published it then in our books. So yes, they were a part of the process, but on our request and not on their initiative. Since my focus is exactly the eve of 80s and 90s, my questions are focused on this law on basic education of 1992. If we compare this law with laws on education that existed at that time in any European countries, not only Belgium but others like Germany or France, do you think that
Russian education law of 1992 really stands for one of the best examples of educational law at that time? Or, well, what would be the comparison?
Yeah, well, it do answer definitely on high standards in education. You should read my comment on the basic law. I raised many questions, but in an always positive and constructive way. But there were questions, of course, on sustainability and on predictions and on. But as such, it was definitely a good piece of legislation responding to international criteria of best practices. Of course, political options. That's the choice of Russian legislator on finance and on vouchers, and on the contract, say between teachers or professors and founding. But that's of course every nation, because education is a national matter, national common, has to lay down in the law his vision, his strategy, his soul, his convictions. After huge debate, and after, let's say, being confronted with questions and with remarks. So you do not have to reach consensus internationally in all pieces of legislation. I just came back now from Albania, where I raised within the parliament and after having met the minister and academia, I still raised 7 fundamental questions on the draft law. I just had here academics from other countries on their draft legislation on higher education. So, taking into account the options and the strategies will have to be chosen by national authorities, and who are not always ours, definitely not. But yes, in technically speaking, it was one of the best models of that period of time, evidence, internationally, even worldwide. The commitment to change and to reform was clearly embedded in several chapters, and we also tried to, for instance, on legal status of the teacher and even of the pupil, with some reflections vis-à-vis the past. So try to combine and the past and the future, and for that reason, that basic law was an excellent example. Yes.
And thank you so much. Again, I just don't want to bother you too much, but I have the last final question. You've already mentioned that Dneprov was very much inspired by the idea of the rule of law. But apart from this, of course, hugely important idea, what other values did he or his Russian colleagues treated as the key features of Russian educational policy? What was their vision of a true reformist stance in education?
They were aware of what I'm teaching, and I'm publishing on this issue quite extensively, on the idea that if you want to reform a society, start with schools. No change in society in all its aspects can be of any success if you cannot, let's say, drive the process through education. They were convinced of that mission. To start with trying to make democratic character out of the education system, open, international, but also respect for the national values and for the need for coherency. Education also to some extent as a unifying factor of a nation, but taking into account also the plurality. The social protection was for them a crucial issue. paid much attention in our talks on salaries, on financial, where I did not convince always the ministers, also chiefly not in higher education, was on modern practices in Europe, for instance, on access to higher education. We were not that successful in all aspects of the education, but show them better examples, or having at the minimum the direction you have to take. So rule of law, democratic character of education, role of education as such, social protection, mobility, unifying factor, and still the strong, let's say, central character of education. So I did not convince them on what we call the principle of subsidiarity. Give much more competence to local, including the school community. I repeatedly say, well, bureaucrats are not the experts. Experts are school leaders, are teachers, are principals. Those are within school community. That are the experts, and you have to trust them. Give trust, and that was not that always that easy. But so we were not as successful on improving, let's say, the local or the regional or the oblast republic dimension. And on finance, we were not that successful either, in some respect. But openness, international orientation, quality, but still some bureaucratic reflections still were always, to some extent, present. The long list of procedures for authorization of license, evaluation, assessment, accreditation, I listed 7, 8 techniques hindering new initiatives. They were good. They had goodwill, but the consequence of making a real reform happen nationwide, according to European best practices. The commitment was there, but we have to be modest and humble. So that will be probably my final appreciation. We were present. Our idea was present. Openness and an excellent cooperation, even having an impact on draft texts and on some chapters and on even some laws. But at the very end, let us remain modest and humble, and keeping in mind that, of course, ownership is always those of the Russian authorities. But we learned enormously from them, and I often remind my students, well, my best students are Russians, because they're also open for culture. There is no one of my European students, even not of my Japanese students, or my American students, who are so close to culture, who know world literature. Of course, because of world literature is often Russian. But so the openness, and also with academic leadership and student leadership, was quite visible and tangible. So we learned enormously from Russian profoundness and the cultural heritage and the Russian ambition. So we have to be honored to be able to work on these laws.
Thank you very much indeed. That was my pleasure to talk to you, and I'd appreciate if you could send me the books you've mentioned.
Yes, Peter.
That might be of extremely importance for me. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much again.
We will do so. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, that was my pleasure too.
I hope to meet you very soon.
Yeah, see you later or
Peter,
sooner.
bye-bye, ciao.
Bye.